On this episode, we cover the Joe Rogan Experience 2524 with guest British Member of Parliament, Rupert Lowe. No Rogan Experience Season 4 starts now. Welcome back to the show. This is a show where two podcasters now with 214 hours of Joe Rogan Experience get to know Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan is one of the most listened to people on the planet. His interviews and opinions influence millions. He is regularly criticized for these views, often by people who have never actually listened to Rogan. So we listen and, where needed, try to correct the record. It's a show for those who are curious about Joe Rogan, his guests, and their claims, as well as for anyone who wants to understand Joe's ever-growing media influence. I'm Cecil Cicirello. That's Michael Marshall, and today we are going to be covering Joe's July 2026 interview with British MP Rupert Lowe, which now has 2.4 million views on YouTube alone. Marsh, how did Joe introduce Rupert in the show notes?
Rupert Lowe is a British politician who served as the Member of Parliament for Great Yarmouth since 2024 and the leader of Restore Britain.
Is there anything else? I feel like I'm going to be opening the floodgates here when I ask this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there anything else we should know about?
Yeah, there really is. So Rupert Lowe made his name as a trader for Deutsche Bank and Barings Bank. That's how he made millions. So he'll do a kind of the common man of the people, the common sense kind of party, but he's coming from like a city trader background.
Okay.
He was a member of the Tory party, but he left the Tory party because he didn't like the Maastricht Treaty in 1993, which brought us closer to the EU. He's an extreme anti-immigrant politician. That's been his politics for some time. He was elected member of the European Parliament for Nigel Farage's Brexit party for a while, until we fully Brexited, although he would disagree that we've even fully Brexited. We didn't get a proper Brexit, if you ask him. He later got elected for Nigel Farage's Reform UK party as the MP for Great Yarmouth, and he was basically the first MP Reform ever had. Then last year, while MP for Great Yarmouth, he posted about how he personally had gone to the beach to stop a boat of migrants from landing on the shores of his constituency.
This is this guy?
Yeah, this is this guy. Only to find out that the boat he'd been chasing down the waters was an effort by Royal Marines to row around the British Isles to raise money for a motor neuron disease charity.
Amazing.
So
amazing.
That's the stellar intellect we're working with here. Yeah. But also last year, he was actually suspended from Reform UK as a politician because he was being investigated over accusations of bullying within the party, including credible evidence that he and his staff mistreated two female members of the team in ways that amounted to harassment, according to the complaints against him. During that suspension, he left Reform. He stood as an independent because he didn't lose his seat. He just lost his party affiliation. And then he set up Restore Britain as an even further right-wing party alternative to Reform UK. And there he welcomed the support of notorious racists and propagandists like Tommy Robinson, who's a very vehement supporter of the party. When Elon Musk eventually got bored of Nigel Farage being his racist plaything du jour, he put all of his weight and propaganda engine behind Rupert Lowe's new party. And that's basically why anyone outside of a handful of racists in the south of England have even heard of this guy. And then in June, Restore Britain launched their Rape Gang Inquiry Report, which they say is an independent report into the abuse of mostly white, mostly working-class girls by gangs of mostly Indian and Pakistani paedophiles in northern English towns. That report was music to Elon Musk's ears. That is why Rupert Lowe is now on Rogan, getting 2.4 million people watching him on YouTube alone.
Yeah. I do understand why Rupert Lowe loves Brexit, because Brexit is the most important meal of the day for sure. So I understand. I do get it.
I hate that my entire political life has been defined by such an ugly portmanteau. Like, at least have given it a more interesting or nice word than that.
Right? It's got to be something better than that.
Heartbreaking.
Okay. So what did they talk about on this particular episode?
So mostly they start a lot with the rape gang report that Rupert Lowe has published and how it is a major problem in the UK when white girls are raped by men who aren't white. That's a major problem when the rapists aren't white. They also talked about immigration a lot. They talked about Restore UK's plan for mass deportation of not just migrants, but also second and third generation migrants. They talked about DEI, free speech, George Orwell, although we get George Orwell very wrong.
Really do.
They talk about how Britain has never been anti-Semitic. They talk about socialists and the Fabian Society and the worthlessness of humanitarian degrees. They talk about ivermectin, the COVID vaccine, water fluoridation, and how handguns in the UK were banned due to one murder. And that is a clip that's gone viral.
Nice. Okay, well, before we get to our main event, we want to say thank you to our Area 51 All Access Pass patrons. That's hello, Christy. Yes, you, Christy. Hi, I'm talking to you. Can you hear me? I'm tired of arguing which of us likes Eli the most. We just need to agree that he is the greatest, best friend ever. Stone Banana, Angie Madkey, Cindy Lynch, yes, that's Cindy Lynch, Fred Argruthius, Laura Williams, no, not that one, the other one, Lucy Cortez, Billionaire Oligarchs, Morgan Gordon, Scott Laird, Darlene, Left Hand Voodoo, Carissa Gunderson, 3 seasons. This 4th one is total landscaping. That is genius. That is amazing. Chunky Cat in Chicago loves their Aunt Aoife. Matthew Cutler, autistic Twitch streamer, twitch.tv/MTC_streams, Stargazer97, Dr. Andrew Gibson, online physics tutor, Ramsham Tickler, Gina Maloney, Don't Thank Me, Your Show Is Just Worth Investment, and Megan Bray. They all subscribe to patreon.com/NoRogan. You can do that as well. All patrons get early access to ad-free episodes as well as a special patron-only bonus segment every single week. And this week, they're basically going to talk about the same stuff they talked about in the main episode, but it's more funny. So you're going to want to listen to that instead because we make jokes during that portion of the show. So you can check that out, patreon.com/NoRogan.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, as well as all of those patrons, I just want to give a huge thanks to all the people who subscribed between our seasons as well. I know we ended the last season by explaining how much your support means to us and how it helps us carry on doing this show. And a bunch of people subscribed between this season, last season, and the start of this season. So if you were one of those people as well, or anyone who has been subscribing to us, thank you so much. It really means a lot to us.
Yeah, thanks so much. All right, now our main event.
Time.
Huge thank you to this week's veteran voice of the podcast. That was Slimy Clitty announcing our main event. Remember that you too can be on the show by sending us a recording of you giving us your best rendition of It's Time. You can send that to knowroganpod@gmail.com as well as how you'd like to be credited on the show. That's KNOW for no there. I just want to mention before we jump in, and I'll be brief because this is going to be a pretty long episode, and there's a lot to talk about in this episode. Our main event is going to be talking about the rape gang report, and then we're going to be talking about immigration in the Undercard, which is sort of ancillary to this. And then there's obviously going to be an off the record segment that's going to be full of interesting things to talk about as well. But one of the things that I wanted to bring up to you, Marsh, is I've been paying attention to the Joe Rogan subreddit. Okay. And this episode hit. And since this episode hit, I have seen a ton of posts about how bad it is in the UK, how much immigration is changing the structure of the United Kingdom. They're posting all the rage bait stuff you would expect to see posted, Great Britain, people in Great Britain losing their free speech, et cetera, et cetera. And it had a real effect. Even the post about this in their, because often Joe's shows will get posted in that subreddit, and it's kind of a hate subreddit. So people will go and they'll shit on the show. This one did not have as many at all. In fact, a lot of people felt like they were very enlightened by Rupert
Wow.
Lowe. So that's something to think about too, is that this person, even though they come on and they spout a bunch of falsehoods, it's a lot of things that people want to believe, including Joe Rogan. And so what you get a chance to see is a lot of people confirming their own biases by hearing this guy tell their biases back to them. And that's something really important about the Great Replacement theory and these people who wield it as a weapon, that this sort of thing, it magnifies. This has been picked up, I think, at least, and again, it's only a very small sample size, right? So I can't tell you if it's been picked up widely as such, but it certainly has been something that I think a lot of people have been sharing, specifically because it confirms their own biases.
See, that's very depressing. And I guess a lot of those people don't actually know a great deal about British politics. So when they see what is a very, I imagine they'll consider well-spoken, very posh, privately educated English gentleman type explaining how he thinks it is, I imagine they're going to take it like he's telling the truth, like it's accurate. I mean, I think he's saying what he believes to be true, but I don't think it's remotely accurate. And we'll even see in the Off the Record segment how out of touch he is with the British public. He complains about how hard lockdown was for him because it was hard to get to people to come over to his private tennis court to play tennis with him. So, he's not the best arbiter of what's really happening in Britain right now. But I guess a lot of people who are, especially international or American fans of Joe Rogan, won't really know that this is not reflective of what's happening in my country currently.
All right, well, let's set the record straight. We're going to get started with the first portion of the show. This is our main event, talking about this rape gang report. And this is the very beginning of the show. They introduce each other. They introduce themselves to each other.
Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it.
No, it's my pleasure.
And thank you to Brett Weinstein, Jordan Peterson, and Elon Musk for helping connect us.
We are going to see Elon on Sunday, so he's been an incredible support for us. So I don't know how you want to play I'm totally in your hands. I'll follow your lead. But, I mean, he's been helping us because Britain's in bad shape. And
and that's why you're here. And this is what we're talking about.
So, okay, Britain is in bad shape, but a large part of the bad shape we're in is because people like Elon Musk can throw their money and influence around to over-promote people like Rupert Lowe. Like Rupert Lowe, as I say, he used to be in Reform after he was suspended, but he left Reform after being suspended over the bullying accusations. Elon Musk used to back Reform, and then he switched from Reform to this new party, Restore. And now we've seen the support for Reform plateau. And Reform is starting to struggle. Nigel Farage has had to resign as an MP, and now he's going to stand for the same seat and got into a whole thing about the cryptocurrencies he's been accepting and the potential money laundering involved. Those are other factors. But the fact that we've seen some momentum switch from Reform to Restore is testament to the oversized impact of Elon Musk's light is the light beam that he's pointing on different parts of the darkness of British politics. And he's amplifying these people like Rupert Lowe and Reform UK and Restore you. Rupert Lowe and Restore Britain, I can't even get the parties the right way around. They're so fucking one's such a sort of a knockoff of the other. But Rupert Lowe's party shouldn't be in any real conversations. Restore style themselves as outsiders, insurgents, but they're backed by billionaires, and that allows them to run a campaign almost entirely through social media to start gathering momentum in this kind of way. And just look at how he's even here on this show. Joe is talking about his network. It's Eric Weinstein, it's Jordan Peterson, it's Elon Musk. Those are the people who are involved in getting a politician with extreme policy proposals, getting him a platform on the largest podcast in the world, being framed as a voice of reason and accuracy and truth. This is how the sausage gets made. This is how the opinion gets laundered.
Yeah, it's a great point, Marsh. I'm reminded of the coverage we did when Alex Preddy was murdered by ICE agents, and we covered Andrew Wilson on the show. And Joe was telling Andrew that the quote unquote riots, the protests that were happening in Minnesota at the time, they were all coordinated. All this stuff is coordinated. These people aren't from there. They're shipping them in. They're being paid. They have pre-made signs, et cetera, et cetera. It's basically being orchestrated by the elites, right? That's sort of part of the Great Replacement theory. And one of the things that's so interesting is here is a podcast meant to influence millions of people orchestrated literally by elites, right? This
Yes.
is being orchestrated by Elon Musk. This is someone who is a person who is arguably the richest person on the planet is now talking to the person with the biggest microphone on the planet and orchestrating getting his viewpoints in front of that person. There's nothing more, organized than this. This is one of those moments that is, it's really telling too that they just tell you that it happened right at the beginning as if it's nothing. This is a huge deal. People should be paying attention to this.
Oh God, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we're skipping no tape. They start talking about this report. This is the report that Restore had put together.
Well, the rape gang, we've done. This is we've crowdfunded this.
Okay,
which I'm very happy to talk to you about. Which I think
just this title of that rape gang report.
Yeah,
the idea that there's actual rape gangs in the UK in 2026, and is it being ignored? Is it being downplayed? Like, how is it being received by the media and by the politicians over there?
Well, the history of it is that basically, as you probably know, Britain, after the war, decided they were going to play a part in Europe, a bigger part in Europe. Well, our elite did, the British elite. And to do that, they had to basically diminish the power of the nation state, and they had to head towards this European superstate, which is the EU, the genesis of which was obviously a monopoly.
Why did they have to diminish the power of the nation to do that?
Because I think Britain was a proud nation state. We with the American help, we'd won the war, and we hadn't been invaded or conquered, which most of Europe had been. So you'd had mass dislocation in Europe. Huge numbers of people had been dislocated and pushed all over Europe. And I think the socialists, I was in the European Parliament, so I spent a brief time as an MEP, a member of the European Parliament, when we finally achieved, a kind of Brexit. We can talk about that, but it wasn't a proper Brexit. So I think the genesis of the rape gangs, going back to this, was the fact that multiculturalism was the order of the day. They wanted open borders. They wanted a multicultural society. They basically felt the nation state had been the cause of world wars, effectively starting with Napoleon. Then obviously we had the Kaiser, then we had Hitler. And I think they saw it that way, the Monnets, the Spinellis, and the people who constructed the European Union. So to the rape gang report, which was your question, ultimately that the genesis of that is this multicultural invasion almost of Europe.
Can I pause you for a second?
Please do. Please pause him for even more than a second, ideally. Look at this here. The question was, how was your rape gang report being received in Britain? And his answer was, well, the EU was constructed to weaken the power of the British state by pushing multiculturalism and diversity, something, Hitler and the Kaiser.
Yeah.
This just shows where he's really coming from here. And it shows also, I think, where his main concerns are. Because if I was to put together a report into a systematic abuse and rape of underage girls in the UK, I wouldn't start by talking about the history of the EU and multiculturalism. I'd start by talking about the experiences of the victims. The victims, I don't think he mentions the victims hardly at all in this entire thing. He certainly does not center them in any kind of way. But Joe is, and even at the start of this, Joe is saying, well, just the title, the Rape Gang Report, that's shocking enough. It's like, but Restore chose the title, Joe.
Yeah,
it wasn't handed down to them. For what it's worth, we will link the report in the show notes. But here is what what the charity Rape Crisis have said specifically about it. It's unhelpful and irresponsible to attribute sexual violence and abuse perpetration uniquely to specific races, ethnicities, or religions. The solutions tackling rape, sexual abuse, and exploitation lie in joined-up efforts within and across the diverse array of communities and contexts who live in the UK. Framing the issue squarely in terms of immigration undermines joined-up community-based responses to tackling misogyny and rape culture. Such framing also encourages people to believe that some are safe and others are dangerous, when in reality the fact and risks of sexual violence and abuse exist in all cultures, communities, and contexts. It goes on, this is a further quote from the Rape Crisis charity. A 2023 report by His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services concluded that the majority of offenders in the cases they reviewed were white. Data from the National Police Chiefs Council showed in cases where ethnicity had been known, 70% of grooming gang suspects in 2023 and 63% the first 9 months of 2024 were white. The Home Office's 2020 review of child-based sexual exploitation concluded there was insufficient evidence to support claims that any one ethnic group is disproportionately responsible at a national level. That blows the entire conclusions and entire purpose of Rupert Lowe's rape gang report out of the water. He's here to say it's multiculturalism, and he's going to explain that people from Indian and Pakistani and Muslim heritage do not value white girls, and that's why they are more likely to rape white girls. And there's no evidence that's true. White men are way more likely to rape people in this country, my country, than men of any other ethnicity, just purely by the number of people here.
Yeah. And he does frame it. He's talking about a multicultural almost invasion. He's sort of hedging it a little by saying almost invasion, but it's multicultural invasion is what he says. This is the same stuff that they talk about here with open borders, et cetera. And this is straight Great Replacement stuff. And just like this report said, and just like you said, this is tying rape to people from another culture as if rape doesn't exist without immigration. And that's just not true. It's just what it is it's meant to scare people. And it's useful, I think, at this point to just sort of read a definition of what the Great Replacement theory is so people understand what it is. And so I'm going to use Ibram X. Kendi's definition because I think it's a really succinct definition. Great Replacement theory can be defined as a political theory that powerful elites are enabling peoples of color to steal the lives, livelihoods, cultures, electoral power, and freedoms of white people who now need authoritarian protection. And it's a really succinct definition. And I think this is sort of exactly what is happening this episode is there's a bunch of falsehoods that are going to be said, but very specific. These falsehoods all have a purpose. And the purpose is to scare the people in Britain to vote these people in power so that they can then accumulate more power. That's literally what it's for. And that's why this report was made. That's why they specifically do this, is because they want to make sure that they frighten people and say that there are dangerous immigrants that are coming here and they're going to take away your life and your livelihood and you need to protect yourself. And the only way to do that is to get Rupert Lowe and his party elected. Okay, so this next clip, this is talking about the report still, but this is skipping ahead maybe 15 minutes or so.
To your point, I couldn't agree more. And the rape gang report, which we've written, was crowdfunded by 20,000 concerned English people who we raised not a huge amount of money. We raised about £600,000, and varying quantities people gave, and we did it because the government will not have a statutory inquiry. So our government, and particularly the Labour Party, have been presiding over this because it goes to the Muslim bloc vote. So we have in the UK a system of postal voting. And in a lot of the inner cities and the places where these Islamic populations live, they are or have historically voted Labour. That's beginning to change. They're beginning to vote for Muslim independence now. And I sit with some of them at the back of Parliament. So effectively, this inquiry we did, we set out with a completely unbiased view of what we would find. And we did it because we were pushing the government to have a statutory inquiry. And a lot of the reason I got involved in it was I think it was Elon Musk who triggered. He talked about it because a lot of people in the UK, I don't think, know the extent to which this has been happening and the length of time it's been happening for.
A small thing before we get into like the substance here. He says in the UK we've got he talks about the Labour vote goes with Labour Party is courting the Muslim bloc vote, and that he says so we have in the UK a system of postal voting, and in lots of inner cities Islamic populations vote Labour. Why is he bringing up postal voting there? I think he's bringing it up to try and suggest that there's some kind of voting shenanigans because we don't all vote by post. Anybody can choose to vote by post, or you can go to an actual polling station. I don't think there's any real evidence that like people from Muslim backgrounds are more likely to postal vote. I don't see that in the slightest. And even if they were, there's no sign there's no suggestion at all that would actually lead to any kind of voter fraud. There were accusations in the Makerfield election that we recently had or maybe there's one before Makerfield. In a recent election, there were allegations that Muslim families were disproportionately going into the polling station together and therefore telling their elderly relatives who to vote for, something they called family voting. So there are kind of whispers around both Restore Britain and Reform UK that if it's a vote by a Muslim person, it may well be fraudulent in some kind of way. I assume that's what he's trying to suggest here. Not totally clear, but just a weird aside on the postal vote. As for this report isn't an official document, although it has a big black front page and the rape gang report. It's not an official document. It's something that Restore Britain put together in order to push their own political talking points.
Sure.
They raised £600,000 to write basically a list of what was mostly already known. They did talk to some other people who were victims. They didn't talk to other people who were victims. But then they wrote down what they would like to happen as a result. Literally, the opening quote of the foreword to their rape gang inquiry report is, Britain doesn't have a racism problem, it has an immigration problem. That's the opening line.
Yeah, well, a quick follow-up question for them. What color immigrants don't you like? Because I think that's an important piece. Is this against American immigrants coming to the UK? Is that something that you're pushing against? I don't think so.
Yeah, exactly. This is not a report primarily about the crisis of young women being sexually abused by anyone. This is a report about how immigrants shouldn't be here. It cites as a credible source Tommy Robinson. It actually describes him as a whistleblower who gives whistleblower testimony. He's not a whistleblower, he's a propagandist. It even in the report calls for the reintroduction of the death penalty to the UK. That's where they're coming from.
Wow.
And it says, and this is a direct quote, any British citizen convicted of these offences who holds dual nationality must lose their citizenship automatically upon conviction, rendering them liable for deportation. But what that can mean in terms of dual nationality is it could be people who were born here, whose parents were born here, whose grandparents came over in the Windrush generation when we were actually calling for people from various parts of the British Empire to come and staff the NHS, for example. You could be somebody who's got dual nationality because your grandmother was from the Caribbean. If that's true, Restore want to deport you to wherever your grandmother came from, regardless of whether you've ever been there before.
Jesus.
That is the repercussions of that policy. It's not just like the people who've migrated here. It's people whose grandparents migrated here.
Wow.
He says the UK government doesn't want to do a statutory inquiry. The reason for that is because there's been reports and there's been inquiries. They were reluctant to do it initially. There was the Casey report in 2025 and there was the Jay report in 2022. So these are recent reports. They were extensive. They interviewed victims. They made very clear and actionable recommendations for how to improve things and protect people in the future. So when he's calling for a statutory inquiry, it might sound like he's the one calling for transparency, but what he's really doing is, let's kick the can a little bit and carry on making political hay over this rather than get action. And as a result, there is now actually a national independent inquiry into grooming gangs. And that's kind of already started. It's not to his satisfaction, though, because both he and Restore and also people like Nigel Farage at Reform UK, they don't want a national inquiry into where young girls are being abused by gangs. They want one specifically that focuses on abusers who were Muslim. Nigel Farage of Reform UK got up in Parliament and he specifically said, what we need and what they're calling for is a rifle shot inquiry, one that specifically looks at to what extent were gangs of Pakistani men raping young white girls. So this isn't they're not calling for a look at how are girls generally being abused and where's the main threat coming from. They're saying this should only be an inquiry into Pakistani men and young white girls. Interestingly, while Restore put out a call for victims to come and give testimony, among the victims who did come forward to talk to Restore was Femi Mohammed, and they were keen to speak to her. But while they were in negotiations of how to get to speak to her, they told her very late in the day that actually her evidence would not be heard by them in their rape gang report, even though she felt she had been raped by a gang. She believes it's because she is a victim, but she's also a Muslim, and she didn't fit the narrative that they wanted to tell. She posted to Twitter, Rupert Lowe has criticised the government for failing to take white rape gang victims seriously and accused it of anti-white racism, yet the inquiry he chairs has reflected similar discriminatory prejudice against me. It appears that my removal from the inquiry may be linked to my identity as a Muslim woman who's unwilling to compromise her faith, as reflected in an increase in anti-Islamic statements following my exclusion and during the inquiry hearings and thereafter.
Wow.
So some victims are worth more to Rupert Lowe's report than others.
So this next clip, he poses this matriarchal society versus justifying rape.
There are all sorts of hadith rulings which they can use to justify it. I mean, for instance, if they rape a white girl, that doesn't count in their view of life as adultery. So they are effectively taught that a girl who doesn't dress as they would dress is meat to be abused, and they have these extraordinary sort of cultural views that are completely incompatible, in my view, with a society like ours, where we are a matriarchal society which respects women. I think we have grown to respect women. Obviously, they've now got an omnipotent position within our society. Certainly in the UK, I'm sure it's true here too, and quite right. They play a part in our society. They're a very, very important part of everything. But again, under the Islamic code, I think that the Muslims are frightened of female sexuality. It's all there. And as you know, you get FGM, female genital mutilation. So these cultures, I think, Joe, and to your point, are just incompatible unless you have a very strong government which basically protects its electorate from any subversive behavior which is not compatible with our values.
You keep using the term meat. Is that how they actually refer to it as?
That's how they consider it. Yeah.
What do they say? Like how are they?
It's in our report that there was actually I think it was. Is it a translation of? I think Thomas Jefferson actually. It's in our report. Asked the Barbary pirates about the way in which they treated their slaves and their women. That was particularly slaves. They just also slavery is accepted within Islamic countries. So I think they have their own codes. They have their own terms of reference. And there is a quote in there. I'd have to look at the report to give it to you, but where one of them does liken white girls not dressing as Muslim girls dress, and he does liken it to meat.
Jesus.
And that is an analogy he used. So I mean, yeah, I think that's what they think.
So yeah, let's unpack this because there is a lot in this. Starting with the idea that UK, here in the UK, we are a matriarchal society. Women have an omnipotent position.
Sure.
That is delusional. That suggests that Rupert Lowe has never really spoken to any woman about how her life is or what difficulty she ever faces. And bear in mind, Rupert Lowe, even while this conversation is happening, is under investigation for the bullying of staff members to a degree that counts as harassment. While he's overseeing this report of I will protect the women of the UK, he's currently being investigated for harassment of women. So yeah, it is delusional, and I would say arguably disingenuous to believe that he thinks this is true about British society.
I mean, as you pointed out earlier, they don't even really mention the victims very often. So
No.
What are you talking about? That it's all about? It's not about that at all. And very specifically, the patriarchy in general tries to overprotect women, almost with an authoritarian perspective, to take away their rights because they don't know what's good for them. And so that's, I think, one of the things that's leading all this. He's saying matriarchal, but it really leads back to the patriarchy.
Yeah, exactly. And to be clear, part of the reason there is a problem, there has been a problem with grooming gangs in the UK in certain parts of the country. Rotherham, quite famously, there was a gang of men of Pakistani descent who were abusing young girls. That isn't reflective of all Pakistani men. It's reflective of those guys who were doing that. And the reason they got away with it so long is that the white police didn't see the working class girls as legitimate rape victims because they were poor, because they'd committed other crimes in the past. So their testimony wasn't believed. And if it was believed, it wasn't acted on because, well, those girls are just like that, aren't they? So this wasn't a case of racism by the Pakistani men. This was a case of misogyny. That's a huge part of it. This was an example. This absolutely wasn't an example of a society that gives women too much power, meeting a culture that doesn't. This was how little are women respected already in British society, especially if they're from certain backgrounds like white working class. And then he brings up, and he will say this a lot to the point where even Joe has highlighted, he keeps talking about how Muslims think of white girls as meat. That is the quote he keeps using. They just see them as meat. He brings that up, first of all, as a thing that Thomas Jefferson said. That's his justification for why it's in the report as to why girls were being raped by Muslim men in 2020 was, well, Thomas Jefferson once met a Barbary who talked about slavery. Ludicrous. This is actually, I went to his report. This is the relevant section in his entirely unbiased report into the crisis of rape gangs in modern UK. This is the quote, "Yet the historical record reveals a long-standing pattern of Islamic enslavement and sexual exploitation of white women. Historians estimate that between the 16th and 19th centuries, approximately 1 million Europeans were seized for profit as part of the Barbary slave trade. In March 1786, when Thomas Jefferson and John Adams inquired of Tripoli's ambassador to France why the Barbary states waged war on nations that had not attacked them, Sidi Haji Abdul Rahman reportedly answered, 'It was written in the Quran that all nations which had not acknowledged the Prophet were sinners, whom it was the right and duty of the faithful to plunder and enslave.'" Not even a mention of meat in there, to be quite clear, but we're talking about 1786 as his justification. Then he goes on and he says there's a quote in there where they do talk about women as meat. Here is that quote from the report, okay? "Certain Islamic preachers have explicitly endorsed this view following the high-profile convictions of Muslim men of Lebanese background for rape in Sydney, Australia. The country's Grand Mufti, Sheikh Taj al-Din al-Hilali, controversially placed blame on the victims for not being covered and not remaining in their homes. He stated, 'If you take out uncovered meat and place it outside without cover and the cats come to eat it, whose fault is it, the cats or the uncovered meat?' That is the quote, the only quote in which the word meat is used in their entire report. And to be clear, it is one guy in Australia, maybe quite prominently in Australia, but nothing to do with UK Muslims or UK grooming gangs, and he was condemned for it, including by Muslims. And if you think that sounds like special pleading from me as to why this guy's allowed to talk about women that way, just consider if I had scoured the internet for a Christian pastor anywhere in the entire world who'd once said something awful about rape victims and then went on Joe Rogan's podcast to say, well, this is how Christians talk about women. Would that be a reasonable thing to do?
Yeah.
Obviously it wouldn't. He's very clearly finding the worst thing he can find, but he isn't going through this saying, and one guy in Australia called them meat. He's saying that the rapists and the Muslim men of the UK refer to white women as meat, and that is not true. And even in that horrible quote, what you can see is a misogynist who used a disgusting metaphor, but even in the quote that is cited in the report, he's not literally calling the white girls meat, as Rupert Lowe has done throughout this conversation. He's using an analogy that is a misogynistic analogy. Rupert Lowe is using it as if they were calling the women meat. They were saying, oh, look at this meat over here. So he is very clearly taking things deliberately out of context to make them seem far worse than they are, which is bad because it is bad that these girls were getting raped. That should be sufficient. The only other mention of meat in the entire report is a reference to a 2016 book by Peter McLaughlin called Easy Meat, Inside Britain's Grooming Gang Scandal. I haven't read that book. I couldn't find a copy of it online to read, but other titles from the same publisher, from just page 1 of the listings from this publishing company, are Islamizing Europe is the Conquest Inevitable, Woke, a critique of social justice ideology, Jews make the best demons, Palestine and the Jewish question, Profoundly Superficial, Observations on a Net Zero Culture, The Goddess That Failed, Feminism's Unending War Against Men, Families and Civilization Itself, The Case for Colonialism, and The Left is Seldom Right. That's just from the first 20 books on this publisher's website. It's a very niche publisher. I'd argue this is not an unbiased book to put in your report, and that's the only other mention of meat in this entire fucking report.
It sounds like how Tucker Carlson names his videos, actually. Each one of those
it really does.
Like a Tucker Carlson video. All right. This next clip is about the number of victims.
This rape gang inquiry report that you have just released, the number, I want you to say it because it sounds so crazy. If I say it, it's going to sound wrong. What the number of people that were victims, the estimate?
Well, we've estimated that a minimum of 250,000 rapes have taken place. It's probably much, much more, Joe. Because we published in here, I think it's a list of 147 parts of the UK where this is happening. Now, the government tries to tell you it's happening in Rochdale, Oldham, one or two, Bradford, one or two centres, and that's why their statutory inquiry, the terms of reference of that, have now been downgraded. So they make it look as if it's not a systemic problem, but just a little local problem, which it isn't. So we've listed here, and they're all in here, the places where we know it's happening from our rape gang inquiry. But every time we publish this, Joe, I get people emailing us or sending us messages on social media to say, what about Red Ruth in Cornwall? What about it's happening here, it's happening here, it's happening here? So I think it's incredibly widespread. And there's other people who've corroborated that 250,000 figure. That's an incredibly conservative figure.
Okay, now this is a shocking figure. It is not a conservative figure at all. It's far from a conservative figure. So he's talking about, well, the government thinks it's only happening, that the rape gang issue is only happening in certain areas, often called the grooming gang scandal. It's only happening in certain areas. We know it was happening in Bradford and Rochdale and Oldham and Rotherham. We do know some places where it was happening. But Rupert Lowe wants to expand that to anywhere anyone on social media tweets him to say, I think it's happening here. That is his evidence for the 147 or more other places. His citation for this figure is from a thing that someone just said in the House of Lords. This isn't from a report or from police crime statistics. It's someone said. This is the quote. The 250,000 figure originates directly from a statement in the House of Lords by Lord Pearson of Rannoch on the 14th of May 2019, who said, do the government accept that if we extrapolate nationally the J report on Rotherham and other reports from Telford and Oxford, there appear to have been upwards of 250,000 young white girls raped in this century, very largely by Muslim men, usually several times a day for years. He added that the number is probably an underestimate. In this Restore report, they go on to say, when the Rotherham and Telford scale is applied across the documented national distribution and multiplied by the extreme underreporting factor accepted by official reviews, the total reaches the 250,000 threshold as a bare minimum. The thing is, first of all, you can't just take the Rotherham and Telford scale and apply it across everywhere else you think that something like this might have been happening. Because Rotherham and Telford were two locations where prolific gangs had indeed been operating. But what he's then doing is taking those figures and assuming that everywhere else in the country is at least exactly as bad as those two prolific gangs, which is nonsense. Here's an illustration of why that's a bad way to estimate stuff. We know that Jeffrey Epstein abused more than 1,000 victims. But that's just Epstein, though. If we then extrapolate that figure to everyone who ever flew on his plane or visited his island and assume that they were just as bad as he was, the number of true victims of Epstein is in the 200,000, 250,000.
Yeah.
But what's happening is you're picking the outlier and assuming it's the median or assuming it's the average. And that isn't how statistics work. And it gets even worse than that, right? Because he is citing the Telford and Rotherham location factors from the J report. The J report was an official report into the scandal. The J report says that at least 1,400 girls were abused between 1997 and 2013, with some updated estimates exceeding it. But that report is all victims of child sexual abuse in Rotherham in that period. 1,400 girls who were abused by anybody in Rotherham across those 16 years, whether they were victims were white girls or whether they were girls of any ethnicity. And I think actually it might have even included child sexual abuse of boys as well. It also is regardless of the ethnicity of the perpetrator. So if a dad is convicted of abusing his daughter, that would count in this figure, but they would obviously be largely of the same ethnicity, so wouldn't be what Restore is using it to assume. So this takes every single case of child abuse in Rotherham, assumes that every single one of those cases was a young white female victim of specifically a Pakistani grooming gang, and then assumes that every other place in the country where anyone messaged Rupert Lowe about on Twitter must be affected to the same degree, and that's how he gets to a 250,000 figure.
This next clip, this is about testimonies.
So this is, I think it's linked to organised crime. I think it's linked to the drug trade. I'm pretty sure it's linked to the drug trade. And obviously it's linked to prostitution. So as usual, with an evil like this, and you've got girls who are transported around in the back of pickups and in cages. And at our rape gang inquiry, we had examples of girls who were raped by dogs and filmed, either anally raped or vaginally raped, and literally watched, filmed. And a lot of it's about servitude and about, there's other stories in here about women having to lick the feet of their rapists. It's about power, it's about servitude, and it's about the fact that Muslim men are taught to believe that they are superior, not only to women, but they're superior to people like yourself and myself, who are considered to be, if you like, the infidels. And their job is to effectively spread Islam and effectively punish the infidel. And as you probably know, in the Crusades, if you lost to Saladin and you were a Knights Templar, a Crusader, you had two choices. You either converted to Islam or they killed you. And in the case of a lot of these girls, a lot of them were made pregnant. They were impregnated, and they then had to convert to Islam. Some of them were trafficked to Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, other parts of the world. So look, I mean, this is a massive national scandal, and I'm hoping, now I'm an MP, we've written this report, and this should stimulate debate. We've sent a copy of this on a PDF to every MP, and we're going to send this printed copy to all of them as well. Because everybody in power should look at this, and they should start to correct it immediately.
So the stories that he's talking about there, the testimonies he's talking about, what happened in those cases, it sounds genuinely awful and disgusting. And I wish I could take his word for it that they existed. But as far as I can tell, that's all we have. He says all this stuff was filmed, but no footage has ever been reported as far as I can see. Even when many of the rapists have been tried and have been sentenced and are now in prison, the police didn't cite any of this footage he's talking about at the court cases, at the trials or anything. So when he's talking about all this footage, we don't have any evidence that it's there. What he's given us is anonymous testimonies in a report that cites Tommy Robinson as one of the whistleblowers who provided some of these testimonies. So I have an incredibly hard time believing that Restore Britain alone were able to get these accurate testimonies now, when independent inquiries like the J report, which centered victims, didn't get anything of the sort. I went through the J report just in brief. It's a 468-page investigation commissioned by the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, centering the voices of victims and survivors. For example, it doesn't mention dogs once. There's not one mention of dogs in the entire report. And yet he's saying that frequently it would happen that victims would have dogs set upon them. There was some evidence that some victims were kept in place by dogs. So if you try to escape, they'd set a dog on you, like to stop you from doing that, to threaten you with a dog. But no evidence that there was films of people being abused by the use of dogs in that kind of way. As I say, the J report doesn't treat far-right propagandists like Tommy Robinson as reliable sources and doesn't come up with these kind of testimonies that Rupert Lowe is finding. The J report was far from a cover-up or a carve-up. It was damning about how the authorities absolutely let the victims down. I don't think they would have missed this. So if he has evidence that this is true, I think he needs to give us more than his own word for it in the anonymous testimonies, because it's really hard to believe him when he said so much other stuff that isn't true.
Does the report mention the Crusades? Because obviously the Crusades is the exact thing we need to look at to see whether or not people at war should be nice to each other. I don't even understand why he would even bring that up in this particular piece when he's like, oh, well, in the Crusades, when those two people were at war and they treated each other badly, that's a reflection of how Islam treats women. It's out of nowhere. But again, I think all this stuff lands with Joe, right? He's trying to rile Joe up. He's trying to sort of evoke this idea of disgust in Joe. And he's doing a good job by mentioning all this stuff. But like you say, if there's no actual proof of any of this, this is just a propagandist using his propaganda to try to convince someone that something is really awful when he doesn't actually have evidence for it.
Yeah, the fact that he brings up the Crusades proves that, and doesn't really talk that much about the incredible testimony of the victims. It shows that he's not centering the victims here. It's not about how do we stop women being abused in the UK. It's how do we stop Muslims getting into the UK.
Yes.
That's his priority here.
Yeah. All right, so for the last clip in our main event, this is political denial.
Are there people that are in denial that this is happening? That this rape gang problem is real?
Oh, without a shadow of a doubt. Labour.
And what do they say?
Well, Labour just tries to look the other way.
But when confronted by the numbers, what is their response?
Well, we've been demanding a statutory inquiry, and in the end, we crowdfunded this.
Right. What is their response to that?
Well, their response to this has been pretty muted, to be frank. I mean, the BBC haven't covered it at all.
Really?
A national monopolistic broadcaster paid for by a compulsory fee have not covered this as a matter of public interest, nor of Sky, nor properly of the Daily Telegraph. GB News have covered a tiny. Patrick Christys covered one evening of it. Now, this is a massive national scandal that deserves a complete and utter airing.
How does the BBC justify not discussing this?
Well, the BBC is part of our problem, Joe.
So the thing is, this hasn't just been denied and swept under the carpet. There have been full reports. In 2022, the report was released under the Tories. In 2025, it was under Labour. The main parties are not sweeping this under the carpet. And the BBC, they covered those reports. They've covered the grooming gang scandal extensively throughout it being exposed. They aren't covering your report because it doesn't add anything true to the conversation other than that you blame every Muslim for the action of the perpetrators who happen to have been Muslim because you already wanted mass deportations. That's why the BBC aren't going heavy on your new report, because it cites, as you point out, the fucking Crusades and what Thomas Jefferson was told by Barbary slavers. It's not relevant to what's happening to young girls in the UK.
Yeah, I looked up, I tried to find a story on it, and the only story I found that the BBC was talking about it, their first bullet point is lack of reliable data is what it says. So, I mean, the obvious, if they are covering it, they're saying you didn't really do a good job is what they're saying. So, of course, he doesn't want to bring attention to that. So what he'll say is they're not recovering it. Oh, they're not covering. Yeah, they're telling you that you didn't do a good job. That's the key. Maybe it doesn't meet the standard of actual news, which is why they're not reporting on it. It's better than a lot of US outlets, which would probably publish the whole thing as a quote and then find one line from someone who opposes it and put it at the end. That's how they would do it here in the States. I'm glad the BBC has higher standards than that. All right, we're going to move on to our undercard.
And the undercard's banging. The undercard's filled with fights.
So for the undercard this time, we're going to be talking about immigration, and they spend a lot of time talking about immigration. So we got a lot of clips on it. So we're going to jump right in, and we're going to talk about the multicultural invasions a couple minutes into the show.
So what you think is that the multicultural invasion, the way it was set up, was on purpose, and it was on purpose to sort of diminish the idea of nationalism?
Yes, I think
so this was like a long plan. So this was something that they must have had to sit down and like, who would be involved in this sort of a discussion where you would be willing to diminish patriotism, diminish this idea that Britain by itself is exceptional and the people are exceptional?
It was a long, deceitful plan. So I always say,
who implemented it?
The European elites in league with our elite, who effectively, if you remember, in 1975, we joined what was called the European Economic Community. It wasn't effectively anything other than an economic union, but that very quickly changed, and effectively they tried to politically integrate Europe. That failed, and then in 1997 they tried to force it through with the introduction of the euro. So having failed politically, they tried to do it financially.
So the quote-unquote elites in Britain and the elites in the United States, it's coordinated with both of them. So
I think less so in America, Joe. I can't speak for America, although when you look at what the Democrats did with USAID and all the stuff that was going on under Joe Biden, you have to wonder whether they began with the World Economic Forum to play a part in this. But
so it might sound, and this is, as you say, it's only a couple of minutes in, it might sound like what Joe was doing here is asking questions to push back on Rupert's idea of the multiculturalism as what was really behind the deliberate weakening of Britain and then the rape crisis. I think Joe actually means all these questions. I think these are honest questions. He wants Rupert to actually tell him who did all of this. He's not saying, I don't think that's true, justify it. I think he's saying, oh, interesting, tell me more about who did this. I think these are Joe trying to get more information. But I think he knows he's on shaky ground when we're talking about how the elites are deliberately weakening Britain and bringing in migration that doesn't respect British women and things. Because he says the quote-unquote elites is what he's specifically saying. And I think it might be that he's aware that people have used these terms to say, for example, it is the Jews who are bringing in immigration into Europe in order to weaken the power of the white race. So I think he's aware that there is criticism about that. And that's why he's couching this in that kind of way.
Yeah, because he says elites, and then he doesn't name anybody, so it's just European elites. So that narrows it down to Europe, I guess, is the narrow. That's how far we can narrow it down to the entirety of Europe. And then there's also these sort of hand-waving buzzwords that are meant to, in some ways, placate Joe, because Joe understands and his audience understands when they mention USAID, then that's a fraud, right? That's all fraud. It's perpetrated by the Democrats. The only way we found this, and although it starts in like 1961 and goes through many Republican administrations, it only gets caught by a tech bro who happens to be hired by the government very specifically, sussing these things out specifically so he can help promote this very theory of the Great Replacement in our government, right? And then again, it's the same thing. It's that same sort of placating hand wave, stuff by Biden. So you don't have to define stuff by Biden. All you have to do is say stuff by Biden, and Joe understands and the audience understands, and you don't ever have to name your terms. So it's really easy to just keep saying all vague things because the person who he's talking to in the audience understands these vagaries as bad.
Yeah, the sort of the coded grammar of the context of this conversation. And we will see that at other points as well. They talk about how great Lucy Connolly was and various things I think we'll kind of come to, yeah.
All right, so Joe asks, which countries?
So they did this on purpose, and they brought in people from what country specifically?
Well, initially you got in Britain, you got people from Africa. You got the Windrush generation, so you got a lot of Africans came, ostensibly to fill jobs that they always say the British people don't want to do, and it gathered momentum. It was relatively slow to start with, so you had an influx of people coming to the UK. You had open borders in Europe. So one of the absolute embedded rules they have is this freedom of movement concept. So they don't have effectively national borders. But we still obviously had the channel, but we embraced this and we started this immigration. What happened is it gradually happened, and I think these rape gangs have been going on, or we know they have, for 30, 40, probably 50 years, to a lesser extent. But when Tony Blair got in and he undermined a lot of constitutional sort of historical law, you got an acceleration of immigration from other parts of the world, not just from Europe, but also from other countries, South Asian countries in particular, who came to the UK. And the genesis of the rape gangs really is, I think, the cultural oil and water mix of these people coming from what I call clannish societies in South Asia and coming to very high trust societies such as the one we had and the one you have here, which have taken thousands of years to develop.
So to be clear, because we've kind of cut around a bit from the main segment to now, this is the opening 7 minutes. This is still Rupert Lowe's answer to the question about the rape gang crisis in the UK. But look what comes into scope in his mind for it. We're now talking about not just multiculturalism and the EU, but the Windrush generation and Africans and open borders. This is his way of answering why is there a problem of rape of organized rape in the UK. And when he says open borders, the open borders are Okay, there are open borders in Europe, but they are within Europe.
Yeah.
That is the whole point of it's called the Schengen area. The idea you police people on entry into the Schengen area within Europe. And if everybody polices the borders around the entire bloc to the same standard, people inside are considered already vetted, and you don't have to then vet them as they move between countries. It's the same principle when you buy a ticket to an event. They check your ticket at the door, so they don't have to keep checking your ticket at every other point once you're inside, because if you were inside, you must have had a ticket because you're here. It's kind of how the US works. You get your passport checked on arrival into the US, regardless of which state you land in. You don't have to show a passport to then travel from state to state as you cross state lines. But does that mean that, by Rupert Lowe's terms, in effect, there are no state lines or state borders in the US? There are still pretty clear state borders, regardless of the fact that they aren't policed by passports.
Yeah. And listen how he talks about immigrants here. He's saying these people are clannish. They're not as advanced as us. They're savages. We have developed a society over 1,000 years. Our society is better. So listen to how he's talking about people from other cultures as if they are lesser than him. This is clearly racist language.
Yeah, I mean, he says that their society is clannish, whereas America's society is clannish, but just with a slightly different spelling.
We have a K at the beginning of it. It's a little different. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Next in the undercard, they talk about unchecked immigration.
Do they still have that kind of unchecked immigration? Is it currently ongoing?
We still have illegal migrants arriving by boat. They can't be under the current laws and treaties that we're part of. They're not being deported. The judges, thanks to the creation of the Supreme Court, they are now a woke quango. I think a lot of our judiciary is corrupt. So the answer to your question is we still have illegal migration, and we have people living in Britain illegally. We have a lot of foreign prisoners in our prisons, and we have people who've come in under various waves of immigration, one of which, the biggest of which was probably under Boris Johnson, who was actually a Conservative Prime Minister, who allowed thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to come into Britain. And basically, they are now a burden to the British taxpayer. So the answer to your question is they're arriving illegally still. They're living here illegally, or living in Britain illegally still. We've got foreign criminals in our prisons, and we've still got the legacy of this huge amount of immigration which took place.
And are a large percentage of these people receiving welfare from the British government?
Yes.
What percentage?
Well, most of the people who arrive, they're all supported, Joe. I mean, they're put in hotels.
Immediately, as soon as you get there?
In Parliament, I see the contracts. Thanks to my parliamentary questions, I'm allowed to ask questions and scrutinise the contracts for instance, the Bibby Stockholm was a boat which cost the British taxpayer £1.5 billion. It's actually now lying redundant and not being used. But I've seen the contracts for these illegal migrants in terms of the laundry services they get, in terms of the taxi services they get, in terms of the food they require. I mean, literally, it is like it's like staying in a very comfortable hotel. And we've now got these people being settled all across our country.
How many?
In hotels. Well, I don't think the government knows, Joe. To answer your question, I don't think they know how many people are living in Britain illegally.
Okay, so Joe's question here was about unchecked immigration, and Lowe's answer was about undocumented refugees arriving by boat and people in prison, which is not an answer to the question of unchecked immigration. That's a separate issue entirely. And also, Rupert, are you sure that those boats aren't just the military doing a fundraiser? Have you checked that that's not the case with some of those?
They might be trying to row all the way around the country. So
yeah, exactly. Notice that Rupert Lowe also criticised the Boris wave of migrants, but he doesn't tell Joe that the reason there were so many extra migrants coming in from South Asia in particular was because of Brexit, which led to a huge loss of European migration, and we still needed to replace all those workers, but we no longer were able to get them from Europe, and that's why we ended up going to India and various other places. So it was actually a direct result of his Brexit project that we end up with the Boris wave. Lowe is being so evasive in all of his answers here, completely evasive. Joe asks about, are there people, these migrants, are they receiving welfare? Well, the thing is, if you're an immigrant to this country, illegal or otherwise, you're not eligible to receive welfare. You can't get welfare. If you're a refugee or an asylum seeker, you're also not allowed to work. So you don't get like unemployment benefits and things like that, but you're also not allowed to work either. What you will get is a stipend for food, because the alternative is that you starve to death. And it's not a good look for us to have people arrive at this country and then we let them starve to death in accommodation. So it might seem like what we're doing is setting people up for a cushy life. You get to this country and we'll pay for all your food. Specifically, per week, you get £49.18 for each person in your household. And that is to pay for, according to the government, to gov.uk, pay for things you need like food, clothing, and toiletries. And if your accommodation provides your meals, you'll get £9.95 for each person in your household per week instead. So that means you get £7-ish per day, or about $9.50 to spend on food, clothing, and toiletries every single day for all of your meals. Wow. £7 a day. That is the luxury that we're affording asylum seekers and refugees in this country. It is not a luxury lifestyle as Rupert Lowe would like you to believe.
Well, and this is the exact same thing they say here in the States. They'll say undocumented immigrants get Social Security and they get welfare. But the story that Joe and his guests are going to tell is that they're getting that stuff specifically as a bribe to become Democrats, but they don't actually qualify for any of that stuff. They don't get that stuff.
Yeah.
But in our country, one of the main narratives is that they're coming here to take your benefits. They're trying to steal your livelihood. It's the Great Replacement theory.
Yeah, exactly. And like, even as Rupert Lowe is pointing out all the contracts he gets to review because he's a politician, he says laundry services, and Joe laughs at that. But what it means by laundry services is they get what few clothes that they have cleaned for them. Because the alternative is that you make them live in squalor with clothes they cannot clean. They don't have washing facilities where they're living, and they can't afford detergent with the money that they get, so they can put their clothes in a bag and get them washed. That's it. It's not like a fucking on-demand service at a hotel where you can leave a little bag out and they'll clean and dry clean everything for you. And he says about taxis, yeah, we also allow people to take taxis because they have to legally attend immigration hearings and asylum hearings and various authority check-ins. And how do they get there if they can't drive there? We have to be able to get them there sometime. It's not like they can just call up Uber and say, I want to go to the cinema tonight, and I'll get a free taxi there. It's taxis to their legally mandated appointments, because otherwise they'll miss those appointments. All of that is completely exacerbated by chronic underfunding of, for example, officers to process asylum and immigration applicants and cases. Yeah. So if you don't have enough people to work their way through the backlog that's produced, you've got to keep those people somewhere while their cases are waiting to be heard, and that drives up cost and demand. But politicians for years, especially in the Tory government, haven't wanted to put money into hiring people to process asylum seekers because they have a policy of we make it as hard as possible for people to seek asylum.
Yeah, and that's they see that as a feature, not a bug, right?
Yeah.
If you create a difficult process for people to come, you make it Byzantine, you make it hard to understand, you send people to, you give them a giant forms full of tons of paperwork and things that are difficult and written in legalese, they're going to give
just written
up.
in languages they can't speak because they don't have great
often it's in
English.
Languages they can't speak. Now they're in the States, they're trying to make them download an app, and this app, again, is very hard to use. It's all made specifically to make it difficult so that they don't they wind up not coming, or they wind up giving up on the process. And it's very specifically done so that they deter people from doing it.
Yeah, exactly. But the figure that Lowe does give, because he says about all this other stuff, he doesn't give a figure for how much welfare that people are taking up, because the answer in terms of what we consider welfare, like unemployment benefit, would be nil. The figure that Lowe does cite is £1.5 billion. But that was to buy the Bibi Stockholm, which was a boat, like a large shipping boat kind of thing. And the reason they bought that was because they didn't have anywhere to house people. And then the government bought that boat from private stock as a potential way, like a floating housing for migrants to keep all the migrants on the Bibi Stockholm. They didn't, in the end, house any migrants on it because it was an unsafe place to house people and actually was causing, I think it was an outbreak of disease, which is why it ended up being shelved. But this isn't an example of the cost of immigration. It's an example of the cost of not adequately having enough housing for migrants and refugees because you've underfunded it. And now you have to, like, as an emergency, pull a boat out of disuse in order to be a floating hotel, a floating prison for migrants. And I say hotel, he's talking about refugees in hotels. It's like being in a luxury hotel. It's true that refugees are being housed in hotels. We know that because during the race riots, people like Lucy Connolly wanted those hotels to be burned down while the refugees were in them. So we know they were in hotels. But it's not like they're getting their own room and room service and maid service and a turn-down service or everything like that. In reality, it's more like the entire family will be housed in a single hotel room with their £7 per person per day for food for months on end because there's nowhere else appropriate for them to live. It is a problem. Having all these hotels for that purpose is really expensive. But the cause of the problem is that we didn't bother putting money into the housing facilities over a course of decades, and then suddenly we have people to deal with and nowhere to put them. And we have to hire out private hotels to, like, commandeer them to use for housing migrants. So it's a really expensive problem because we didn't plan properly. All of this is just an example of the spiraling costs that come about when you underfund the system for a long time until it fails, and then demand overwhelms that creaking system. And the thing is, here's an irony to this whole thing. Right now, we have got a lot of refugees arriving in the UK. They'll land on the shores of the UK. That might be too many for our current, too many refugees for our current system to be able to manage because of the backlog that we have. But by international law, we have an obligation to look after refugees that arrive on our shores before they're processed. We have to make sure that they're held safely until we process their application. Under EU law, if a member state is overwhelmed by applicants for any reason, those applicants can be moved around to other member states to sort of spread them out and ease that burden. But we can't do that because we're no longer part of the EU thanks to the Brexit that Rupert Lowe wanted. So if he was still in the EU, this migrant crisis that he's talking about wouldn't be a crisis for us because we could say, hey, EU, there's too many people here for us to be able to process. Can we spread them around a bit? And under EU law, they'd have to say yes. We don't get that right anymore because we decided to vote out so we didn't have to deal with migrants.
More repercussions for your actions. That's crazy.
Yep.
All right, next clip. This is about mass deportation.
We think there's enough work to do initially to detain and deport people who are arriving illegally. I mean, to my mind, illegal means illegal.
Right.
So it's fairly straightforward. To the people who are arriving illegally, people living here illegally, the foreign criminals, there's plenty of work to do to remove them from Britain. And then I think we need to turn our attention, and that's in our mass deportation document. I've given you a copy of that, which effectively sets out the constitutional reasons why we have a problem, how we correct those constitutional issues, and how we then practically detain and deport the people who aren't supposed to be here. And once we've done that, we'll then turn our attention to people who are living in Britain, to your point, who are on welfare, who are going to cost the taxpayer a fortune for the rest of their lives probably, who aren't working, who are culturally different to us, who have a different view of their religion to the Christian religion, and are increasingly living in small groups of people who haven't integrated, who are living under Sharia law and who have their own courts. And who
They have their own court.
They have their own courts, Sharia courts, yes. A parallel legal system.
Okay, so it's an unrecognized by the British government parallel legal system that exists inside of England.
It's tolerated.
Tolerated.
It's tolerated.
So they're aware of it.
Yes.
And they're aware of the punishments that this court dishes out?
It's rather like they're policing their own people under their own laws.
And they're just allowing that?
They're allowing that, yeah.
Whoa.
Now I believe, I don't know about you, but I believe if you come to our country, you should live under our laws.
Yeah.
Okay, so his policy of mass deportation is specifically about people who are not culturally like us, to which he includes people who aren't part of the Christian faith. So, like, I guess I'm on the hook here for deportation. But he's not talking about people who are here illegally. He's talking about people who are legal migrants. Once you're here legally, and if you're on welfare, well, you're gone, even if you're legal to be here. And in some cases, he's talking about people who were born here to the wrong parents in his eyes. Those are good to go as well. So British citizens, he's willing to deport if he doesn't like the look of them.
And not being culturally like us is a big feature of the Great Replacement. It's not racist. I'm not talking about race. I'm talking about their culture. It's their culture. And it's a way to obfuscate racism and make it seem like you're not talking about it at all and give you a defending point to say, well, I'm not talking about that. But you are actually talking about that because you're not talking about all immigrants. You're talking about very specific immigrants.
Yeah, exactly. And then when he comes to Sharia law, he said it's a parallel legal system. And no, it isn't a parallel legal system. That, he thinks it's equal to British law in those people's eyes. That is not true. It's not a parallel legal system. Sharia law is not tolerated by the British government. Everybody in Britain has to obey Britain's laws, unless you're rich enough to be able to exempt yourself from some of the laws in particular. But nobody is exempt from the law because they've chosen to follow a different law. Yeah. There's a government document I'll put in the show notes pointing out Sharia councils have no legal status in the UK and are not legally binding under any kind of civil law. They might give some guidance to Muslims, but they are not legally binding and they do not exempt you from British law.
Yeah, and Joe doesn't interrogate this point, I think, because specifically he wants to believe that this is true. So he's biased in this sense and thinks, because he's talked about this with guests over here, right? He's talked about this with American guests who are talking about American policy. They seem to think that certain groups of people can supersede the regular laws around them through their religious laws. And that's just not true here. It's not true there. But I think it's a point that they want to believe, so Joe won't ever ask any real hard questions about it. Okay, so this is about non-integrating cultures on this next clip.
Well, yeah. I mean, the idea of, the United States in particular is a melting pot. And, people come from all over the place, and it's one of the cool things. There's all these different cultures. But there's certain cultures that if you allow them to come into your community and then they institute the laws of the country where they came from, you're going to have a real problem. Like, they don't live the way you live. They don't have the same respect for women that you have. They don't treat them the same way. They don't allow dogs. Like, there's a lot of,
That's right.
stuff that a lot of people might not even be aware that come with that problem. It's like the idea is supposed to be that Western society is inclusive and progressive because we're intelligent and educated and we care. But you can care so much that you let in criminals and then you give those criminals all your money and then the criminals can take over your country slowly but surely. So, and this is no one thinks that's a possible thing. No, people look at the Colosseum, you look at ancient Greece, and they think, wow, I wonder what happened to those guys. What do you think happened? Probably the same shit that's happening right now to England, the same shit that could have happened to America. Civilizations fall apart for various reasons. And one great way to get them to fall apart is to bring in a bunch of people, and they don't have to follow your laws, and they bring the laws of, wherever they're from, whatever fundamentalist religion country they're from, where they have a bunch of crazy laws that are kind of archaic.
And we all know what took down Rome. It was obviously immigration. That was what took down, obviously. Yeah. I mean, don't be ridiculous. That's silly. Of course, that's what took down Rome and the Roman Empire.
God, how much of Joe's classics education comes from the which way Western man memes on Twitter and, hard men, soft times or whatever it is.
Yeah, exactly. And you can hear here an extension of the last clip where Joe wants to believe that this is true. So he's going to try to figure out a way to make it true. And so that's what he's doing here. He's saying the reason why places fall is because they follow the religious tenets of these religious extremists that come to our country. That's specifically what he's talking about. He's saying, well, they don't like dogs. Obviously, they're bad people if they don't like dogs. So you're allowed to dislike dogs, and you're allowed to culturally dislike certain types of food, and you're allowed to. Those are things that we accept. That's okay. But Joe seems to think that that is an indicator that that's how they're a bad group of people. If we're talking about ways in which women are being subjugated, why don't we look at the huge block of Christians in the United States who just took that just took away women's health care in the form of abortion access, right? Let's look at that instead. Why don't we pay attention to that? Instead, Joe is talking about other people from other cultures, and he's talking about brown people here.
Yeah, and I will point out that religious extremists who go to a country and don't respect the people who are already there is literally the founding narrative of your country. That is what you celebrate on every year. Yeah, Thanksgiving.
Yeah, we do have huge blocks of men who were just born here that don't respect women. And one of them happens to be the host of the Joe Rogan Experience.
Yeah, and that host right now is talking to a guy who is under investigation for bullying and harassment of female staffers about how important it is to respect women.
Yeah, I mean, this is really just a sort of a constant effort to try to make immigrants into criminals too. And listen to how he talks about the immigrants in this particular clip. He's talking about how they're criminals, how they're bad, how they get away with it because they follow their own laws. They don't follow laws here. They cannot be integrated. And it's just... what it does is he's basically trying to say this one fundamentalist religion is bad. But there's plenty of fundamentalist religion in our country already that is also bad, right? I think fundamentalist, if you were to ask me, Cecil, is fundamentalist religion bad? I would say, yeah, I think more often than not, fundamentalist religion isn't super great for a lot of people. Yeah. I would agree with that statement. But I wouldn't be picking it based on the shade of the person who happens to be the fundamentalist person who is religious. You know, there's fundamentalist Christianity in our country trying to stop all kinds of things like gay marriage and all these other things, trying to take away your rights. So I just think like what Joe is doing is he's found something he can hitch his sort of inherent biases against certain groups of people on. And this has given him the ability to talk about it on his show in a way that is free and doesn't feel like it can be criticized. All right. Next up, this is about a state failure.
There had been reports in the past. There was the Jay report in 2014, and there's been the Casey report, all of which confirmed that this was happening, and the state still continued to try and pretend it was just happening in a small number of siloed areas where you obviously had a high Islamic population. The state has equally failed to collect data on the crimes that are perpetrated, so the ethnicity of the people who are perpetrating the crimes. And from there, you can extrapolate, once you've got the data, as to whether or not you've got an extraordinary problem in one particular section of society. And again, using my parliamentary questions, I've been forcing as much disclosure as I can get. And this is how we've discovered that a lot of the data that should be being collected by the police particularly, by the National Health Service, by social services, a lot of the data has not been properly collected, possibly because the state does, I think, know that this is happening, but they don't want to admit that their multicultural experiment, which, as you probably know, famously Enoch Powell warned would fail with his speech, the Rivers of Blood speech, for which he was heavily criticized. So I think they do know, but they don't want to admit it. They don't want to be called racist. They don't want to, and this has permeated the whole of British society since Tony Blair. People are frightened to be accused of effectively being biased and white.
Okay, this was one of the shocking moments of this conversation because he is very clearly praising Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. And for those who aren't aware, this was a speech that a far-right politician, Enoch Powell, who's in the Tory party at the time, gave in Parliament, warning that the rivers will run red with blood if we don't do something to curb immigration, that it was the death of Britain, that it was considered to be the high watermark for racist rhetoric in the country. That shocked people at the time and continues to shock people now. But he is very clearly a fan of what Powell was saying and what Powell was all about.
Yeah. I mean, he tries to edge it by saying, he was heavily criticized, but he clearly doesn't agree that he should have been criticized for it. So obviously, what he says here at the end is really telling, where he says that white people are afraid to be called biased and white. White people are afraid to be called biased and white, so we're doing reports now on brown people so you can see how we changed our ways. What a ridiculous thing to say. But yeah, sure, white people are frightened of being called racist, but people of color are frightened of being disenfranchised, or they're frightened of hate crimes, or they're frightened of racial profiling or harsher sentencing or discrimination or deportation. Do you want me to continue of all the things that people of color are afraid of? You're afraid of one thing, the perception of you. They're afraid of real concrete things that happen to them every single day. Maybe the solution is to not be racist. Maybe that's the solution that we're looking for. Instead, maybe just try to listen to the people when they say, hey, you're being racist, instead of just saying, well, I'm really afraid of being racist. Listen to people once in a while when they say, hey, you're being kind of racist right now. And in this whole report and this whole interview, you and Joe are being kind of racist.
Yeah, exactly. For one, I'm white. I am not scared of being called racist. And I think that's because I don't have to try hard to be racist, but when I think, oh, that might be something I need to reflect on, I reflect on it and I change the way that I behave in order to make sure that I'm not being like accidentally, unconsciously biased or things like that. Like, and if someone points it out, so yeah, all right, I'll reflect on that and see if I can do better next time. I'm not scared of it. Like, it's just growth and things. And if you don't want to be racist, maybe don't create a report on a rape crisis that references what Thomas Jefferson was told in 1786 and highlights how much the Prophet Muhammad hated dogs, because those aren't relevant statistics or facts to do with the matter at hand. That's just you being racist.
Yeah.
And actually, that clip, we're going to cut a minute where he just goes on to, because he talked about how hard it is to be considered racist, how scared white people are. There's a minute-long chat about how DEI is terrible. And then Joe says he's just amazed that British people will stand for DEI and stand for the 12,000 people who are being arrested every year for social media posts. And then he says, why aren't people up in arms? Oh, maybe it's because there are no guns in Britain. That's why you aren't up in arms. And then we have this exchange as a result of Joe saying that.
Well, I have actually got some guns, Joseph, because I have a farm. So when you come to the UK, I hope you'll come and shoot some pheasants with me. But
if you don't have a farm,
if you don't have a farm, you'll find it very difficult to get a gun of any kind. And even if you have a farm, so Reform tried to politically assassinate me in early 25, and made false accusations about me threatening to hit one of the Zia Yusuf in a meeting, and somebody was saying I went around Parliament saying I was a very good shot and I was going to shoot Zia Yusuf. I mean, as if you believe that, I've got a completely clean record. I employ lots of people. I have lots of businesses, and I've never had an issue. But listen, 4 armed police turned up, took all my guns away. I mean, and I'm a member of Parliament. I said to them, guys, you could have just called me up and we could have talked about it. But no, they turned up
just from an accusation.
9:30 at night, left at 11:45. We got them on the cameras. Took all my guns, all my ammo, and it took me 5 or 6 months to get them all back. But look, so they don't want the public to have guns, and they are doing their very best to damage the shooters who perfectly legitimately like to go and shoot clay pigeons, who like to go and shoot game, who like to go and hunt. Effectively, they're trying to make that very difficult through the licensing laws for guns. As you probably know, they banned handguns.
The 90s, right?
In the late 90s, because there was a murder up in Dunblane.
One murder.
So everybody, my father used to shoot pistols for Oxford University, and he's dead now, bless him, but he had, all his pistols were taken away. The pistols he used to shoot with at Oxford University.
Okay, so before we get into the one murder comment, notice that I mentioned in the introduction to this, they were talking about how DEI is bad. Notice how quickly, in the space of a minute or two, we're now at people should be armed and willing to fight back, and they don't want people armed anymore. And I think the juxtaposition of DEI, which Joe thinks is kind of, brown people and trans people, and you should have guns, putting those two things close together, I don't think is an accident to how these guys think. But he's saying here, Rupert Lowe, they banned handguns in the 1990s because there was a murder up in Dunblane. Now, maybe he's misspeaking. Maybe that's inaccurate in the way he's speaking, but because he's doing it offhand, he's not given the chance to say things as clearly as he wants to. But Joe gives him that chance.
He does.
And says, one murder.
He does.
And Rupert Lowe repeats, one murder. Genuinely, I was shocked at this. I audibly gasped when I heard this. He's talking about the Dunblane massacre in Scotland. The Dunblane massacre, I remember this from when I was a child. A 43-year-old gunman went into a school and killed 16 5-year-olds. 16 5-year-olds in a class at a school, killed them and their teacher, and injured 15 other 5-year-olds. This was a massacre of little children. And he is talking about this as one murder, that it was ridiculous that we responded this way and took away all the guns. Like, this was such a shocking for Britain, such a shocking national tragedy that we took action and removed all of the guns. And this stays in the cultural consciousness of Britain. When he said this on this show, this made national headlines in the UK for him diminishing the murder of 16 5-year-olds down to just one murder. This is genuinely, I was aghast when I heard this, and I'm not easily shocked by things I hear on Joe Rogan.
It'd be like an American saying, well, come on, man, we changed our whole travel security at airports over one little terrorist attack in 2001. I mean, come on. Yeah, it's the same thing. That's like calling Sandy Hook just one murder. Sandy Hook was like dozens of people were murdered by someone.
Yeah, it'd be worse. It'd be saying you change your entire travel security because a couple of guys threatened a pilot with a box cutter one time.
Yeah.
It's like they did do that, and they used that to kill 3,000 people. Exactly. So you can paint in both ways. Yeah, genuinely, this was shocking to me.
Yeah, that's when I of course, and as an American, I don't know all the mass shootings because there's so many here to pay attention to. I don't know all the other mass shootings that happen around the world. And I was shocked when you told me that this is what he said, especially someone from a place that sort of, I would imagine a lot of people in Britain have a real problem with and they look at the United States as a horror when they think about how many guns we have over here. And to have him just sort of flippantly say that on Joe's show, it's shocking to me too.
Yeah.
All right. Next up, they bring up lovely Lucy Connolly.
And to your point on social media posts, there was a lovely lady, Lucy Connolly, who was locked up for 32 months for just a very emotional social media post, which she deleted after 4 hours, about the Southport killings, where this chap, Axel Rudakabana, went and knifed 3 young girls and killed them. Despite the fact that the British state, through Prevent, was aware of this. And we've had a similar case recently with Henry Novak, where, again, it was actually, I think on this occasion, a Sikh stabbed him. And the police, despite the fact when they arrived at the scene, he told them he'd been stabbed. The police didn't believe him, and they tried to handcuff him. And as a result of that, it's arguable that they opened up the stab wound, and he drowned in his own blood. Meanwhile, his murderer was never handcuffed. So this is where the British state's gone completely wrong. So instead of one law for everybody and one policing for everybody, this sort of view that the white population is racist, which I don't personally believe them to be, I think Britain is a very tolerant country.
But again, what I think is interesting here is just seeing how certain things get woven into the narrative of the arguments that Joe is exposed to and then continues to perpetuate. We've seen that with the 12,000 social media posts. Now that is just true. Regardless of how many times we can point out that he's wrong about it, it's just a true fact in Joe Rogan's world. Lucy Connolly was a martyr, was a free speech martyr, is another of those truisms that's developing in Joe's world from the guests who come on. We covered the story Lucy Connolly in our episode 47 with Francis Foster and Konstantin Kisin. We actually read the court documents about her prosecution, which obviously none of these people have ever done. She called for migrants to be burnt in hotels, and she joked with her friend before she was caught that if anyone asked her about it, she would plead it was a mental health crisis. And then when she was arrested for encouraging the deaths of migrants, she said, I was having a mental health crisis. But she'd already said that's how she joked about that's how she was going to get out of it. This was premeditated and deliberate. And yet he is treating it like, she was just so emotional and she deleted it. He's not actually reading the court documents here. We also covered the Henry Novak killing in our Tucker episode. It was our July bonus. It's an example of the police being incompetent, uncaring, not following their training, requiring better training, requiring better processes, and not doing their job properly. It's not a case of Sikhs being allowed to stab people and never being arrested for it as long as they stab white people. That is not what this is an example of at all. But the repetition of cases like this, they get knitted into this patchwork that becomes a worldview for Joe Rogan. All the edges get trimmed off to make it fit. And that's how Joe goes away thinking that the UK is falling. And that's why, as you pointed out, his many fans on Reddit are now thinking, well, the UK is in such a terrible state because of all these stories they keep hearing. But they're twisted versions of the stories presented in a certain way in order to make you feel something specific.
Yeah, and Rupert's doing that very specifically here. Listen to how he talks about the Henry Novak murder. He says his murderer was never handcuffed. But he doesn't mention that he was sentenced to years in prison for murder, right? He conveniently leaves that piece out because he knows Joe won't interrogate that. Joe won't bring that up. And the audience will hear that and think, oh, that person got away with it. No, they didn't get away with it. They got sentenced to murder.
Yeah, and it's not like even, oh, well, they were going to get away with it, but then the footage got released and now they've been arrested. The footage got released when they were sentenced. We didn't talk about the case during the trial because it would be prejudicial to the trial, and we wanted to make sure it was a secure conviction, so the guy went down for it. But like, this wasn't, it all came out afterwards and now there's been action. This was part of the process. He was already arrested long before you even heard of Henry Novak's killing.
Okay, this next clip's about asking, is this by design? This is another great replacement point.
Do you think that this perspective that society has sort of adopted in the UK about white people being bad, do you think this was, there was architecture to it? This was by design that this was done? Or is this just a natural response to people being called racist? Because of course, in the past, there was more racism than there is today. And people always want to point to that racism as, you know, evidence of colonialism, evidence of whatever it is that happened in days past. But why in England do you think that narrative took hold so well?
Because I think, Joe, to your point, that this post-war plan for multiculturalism, I think they realized that
it was by design.
They've got a problem.
So part of it was probably infiltrating the universities and promoting these kind of ideas.
It's almost as if with the World Economic Forum, there's this view that the Anglo-Saxon nations have commanded and dominated too much of the world's resources. And there's almost like this misguided altruistic view that we should become more concerned with global welfare rather than the welfare of our own citizens, which I totally disagree with.
Well, there's also the "you will own nothing and you will be happy."
This is your Klaus Schwab,
which is hilarious. That someone would even say that out loud.
I know.
You will own nothing and you will be happy. Like, is this a part of an Orwell book? Because this doesn't seem like a real person would say something like that. Because who the fuck is going to listen to that? It doesn't make any sense.
Look at what Joe is getting at here when he's talking about this. This was all by design. It's deliberate. The infiltration of universities to push the narrative. They are doing it deliberately. Who is the they that they're talking about here?
Yeah.
This is all in service to a very specific idea. And I think it could genuinely be one of those instances where Joe is repeating the arguments from people who do mean them as anti-Semitic dog whistles, but he's not hearing the whistle because he just keeps hearing the question in places and assumes these are reasonable questions because so many people around him keep asking them. They're asking those questions because they think the answer is Jewish people are infiltrating the universities in order to push a narrative. But I don't think Joe is necessarily getting that. He just thinks these are genuine questions, and this is how the idea gets laundered.
Yeah, exactly. And the they here are the elites. And they'll never tell you who the elites are, but we all know who they're talking about. We all know who they're mentioning. And then they'll say, like, well, it's done by the other party. The other party, Labor, is the one who's doing all this. They're also the elites in this question, too. They're the ones who are orchestrating this as well. Next clip's about how Britain was never anti-Semitic.
And to your point, I couldn't agree more. I mean, Britain used to be a very tolerant society. So, for instance, Europe was very anti-Semitic. Britain was never anti-Semitic. We used to welcome a lot of Jews and Protestants from Europe who were being persecuted, particularly in France with the Protestants. So we were a very tolerant society, but the people who came integrated and they contributed. And that is the essence, I think, of sensible immigration. So it should be limited, targeted, and it should be only people who accept your religion and your culture and your laws.
But what do you do?
Okay, yeah, Britain was never anti-Semitic. Tell that to literally any British Jew. Like, Oswald Mosley in the 1930s started the British Union of Fascists and was explicitly anti-Jew, pro-Hitler. He was pro-Hitler even into the start of World War II. There was a riot against Jewish people on Cable Street in London. It's like a famous anti-fascist riot where fascists marched to try and smash up Jewish businesses and was met by, as the story goes, like anti-fascist forces from within the Jewish community and supporters in order to push back. So like the Cable Street riots are a part of British like history of the time. But Rupert Lowe apparently has never heard of such a thing. Also, in our last bonus show, even the July bonus show, Tucker interviewed a man on the street who just happened to have a great idea about how Britain should be run and how does current politics works. And when we saw the interview, he just happens to be a huge Oswald Mosley fan to the point where he's dressed like Oswald Mosley. And that man on the street was there campaigning for Restore Britain, Rupert Lowe's party at the Makerfield by-election. So yeah, if Rupert Lowe thinks there genuinely has never been any kind of anti-Semitic movement in the history or present of the UK, he should maybe talk to more people in his party to see what they think.
Listen to this last line that he says. He said, immigration should be limited, targeted, and should only be people who accept your religion and your culture. That is straight out of the Great Replacement theory.
Yes,
the only good immigrant is one who rejects everything about themselves when they immigrate, and they're the proper color, because certain colors are the ones that we accept more. You have to accept the religion of the UK. What if I'm an atheist and I want to become somebody who wants to join the UK? What if I'm a Catholic? Isn't that a different religion than the state-sponsored religion? Isn't Catholicism? It is, yeah. Wasn't there some serious dust-ups in the past between Protestants and Catholics, perhaps in your country or other countries nearby?
There was a couple of snafus.
Yeah,
we don't like to talk about it too much. I mean, Ireland does like to talk about it quite a lot, but the rest of us try not to talk about it too often.
That's an amazing thing to say. But again, it fits perfectly within this Great Replacement theory, and that's what he's pushing.
Yeah, there's no way that Rupert Lowe doesn't read The End of the Merchant of Venice as a heroic victory for the Italians as they force Shylock to give up his Judaism. There's no way in the world he doesn't think that's a happy ending.
Amazing. All right, next up, let's talk about illegal migration.
They shouldn't be coming anywhere under international law because they're traveling across safe countries, so they shouldn't be coming.
What's the estimate of the amount of illegal immigration that you have in Britain?
It's almost impossible to say how many people are living there illegally or living with us illegally. But in our paper, I mean, we think it's sort of 1.8 to 2 million people, probably. That's our estimate. But people arriving, we know how many are arriving. There's a lot arriving every day, particularly when the sea is calm.
How many arrive every day?
They're coming. Well, it can vary. I mean, you can get 1,000 in a day. You can get, if the sea's rough, you get none, because obviously they suffer if they try and cross in little overcrowded dinghies that they can't get across. But we're paying the French over £500 million a year to try and stop it. That, I think, is not happening. And as a result of that, our border patrol picks them up, gives them bottles of water, brings them in, and settles them in hotels and pays them welfare. They become, and then they apply for residency, and they say they're asylum seekers. I argue most of them are economic migrants. But our woke culture is not protecting the interests of the British people.
I hate that people his age use the word woke at all. We should never have allowed that to happen. I hate it coming out of the mouth of an incredibly rich, posh, white English guy like that. He's claiming here that all these people who are coming over, they're coming over illegally, and that you shouldn't do that. He's saying that you have to stay in the first safe country. That isn't true. The law does not say that if you're a refugee, you have to just settle in the first safe country. And there's obvious reasons for that, because if you escape your country to a neighboring country that happens to be considered safe at the time, and you stay there, it might not stay safe for long. If you're fleeing like a rogue state that doesn't respect borders, or if that safe country decides to enter into an agreement to deport you. Like, if we think back to the central history of Europe in the mid-20th century, Jews fleeing Germany, if they'd had to stay in the first safe country, they're going to be staying in France. And that wouldn't have been great when Germany invaded France, or they're going to go to Poland or the other kind of places around Germany. Allowing people to flee to a genuinely safe country, especially safe country where they might have family or some elements of culture to rely on and things like that, that's a much better system. Also, their paper, Restore Britain's paper, estimates that illegal immigration is around 2 million. That is a wild overestimate. That would mean that 1 in every 35 people in this country are illegal immigrants. Not just immigrants, but specifically illegal immigrants. 1 in every 35. That is ludicrous. That's a child in every class in the country.
Well, that's nothing, though. Some right-wing sources estimate that as many as 2.5 million people might be undocumented in my state of Illinois, which has a population of 12.7 million. So the numbers are made up and the points don't matter, Marsh. These people are just making it up as they go along.
Yeah, there's like a 1 in 3 chance that either you or your wife are undocumented at this point, just by the numbers alone.
Don't put us behind those Monty Hall doors, because we're definitely you're gonna lose the Monty Hall problem for sure.
Yeah. And look, other estimates admit that the number is much lower, and those estimates tend to count the number of people who arrived here illegally. But many of the people who arrived here illegally then apply for asylum or refugee status, at which point they're no longer illegal. Like, they got here illegally, they broke laws in order to get from their unsafe country to here. But once they're asylum seekers, they are no longer illegal immigrants. They move from one category to another. If their asylum claim is accepted, they get given leave to remain, which means they are no longer illegal immigrants. They arrived in those illegal immigrant statistics, but they're no longer illegal immigrants. So that's maybe how we can make sense of these ridiculous numbers he's given us.
All right, this next clip is about Dearborn Somalis.
I don't know whether it's quite the same here, whether you've got the similar thing with the Somalis in Minnesota.
You do in Dearborn, Michigan. Dearborn, Michigan just had a gigantic Islamic parade where you just see tens of thousands of people holding flags and walking on the street. And
yeah,
it's kind of crazy. It's crazy. And they've also, one of the things that's funny about Dearborn is all the progressives. It's a very liberal place. They're like, welcome, welcome. Everyone's welcome for all cultures. And as soon as they got into power, they banned the pride flag. That was the first thing they did.
Well, I'm afraid they have quite strong views on that sort of thing.
Oh yeah, that's why Queers for Palestine is always hilarious. Like, and then you see the meme Palestine for Queers, and it's throwing people off roofs. It's
like the chap who runs our Green Party is a gay Jew. So I mean, he's going to have a problem if these guys get anywhere near power. But that doesn't seem to put the progressives off.
So Lowe brings up examples of people living under Sharia law and ignoring the state law. And Joe's example of that is a parade where they had some flags, which was that illegal under normal law, but not under the Sharia law? And it wasn't in Dearborn, to be clear. It was in Hamtramck. And yeah, there's people who are pissed off that they aren't, that the people who've been elected there aren't as progressive as they would like. And that's an issue. But like, I'd argue that banning the pride flag, like they did in Hamtramck once they got elected, I'd argue that seems kind of like they are compatible with the majority of US culture right now. Like, that feels like they've assimilated.
Exactly. Like, if Joe actually cared about gay rights or any of these other people who are using this as a way to say, well, look at what they're doing. Look at what they're doing. You could just codify gay rights. You could just make it a right in this country that you can't ban those things because it's attacking a certain group of people, a protected group of people. We don't protect gay people. So what are you even talking about? And it's interesting that he doesn't mention Utah and Idaho because they both passed measures to ban pride flags statewide from any school or governmental building. So which set of immigrants did that, Joe?
Yeah, exactly. And he says, if Zach Polanski, who's a gay Jewish man, gets into, if the people we're worried about getting into power, then Zach Polanski is going to have a bad time of it because they would be against him. And even though he's advocating for them, they'd be against him. But okay, yeah, progressives might be willing to fight for the human rights of people who wouldn't do the same for them. Apparently that makes progressives the bad guys here. Yeah. I don't get how.
Yeah, and listen how he wants to make fun of people who say, like, Queers for Palestine. Like, you can be against the killing of children in Palestine and be a gay person. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. You can be for both of those things. And it's also, Joe, it seems a little racist to me that you're conflating ISIS to all Palestinians when you say that, because ISIS are the people who threw gays off of roofs, okay? So when you think about, when you're trying to say, well, all brown people do that, that's a little problematic, I think. Maybe you should check yourself.
Yeah, and like, even if Hamas have views that are homophobic, that doesn't even reflect what the average Palestinian thinks, and it also means nothing about the right for Palestinians to not be killed as well.
So this next bit is talking about Islamic society and honor killings.
They still seem to
But this is what's crazy, is that their society is like Islamic society is completely patriarchal. The women are absolutely second-class citizens.
Yes.
They have completely different laws for how the women can dress. What happens to the woman if someone has sex with, first of all, if they commit adultery, they can be killed.
Stoned to death.
Yeah. And I watched a horrible video where a father did it to his daughter.
Yes, well, you do get these killings.
Honor killings. Yeah. Or brothers. The brother will kill the daughter if the daughter shamed the family. It's like, hey, guys, how are you progressive when you're supporting this? And it's because the concept of not being racist, not being called racist, the fear of that is so strong. They're willing to adopt all sorts of things that are the complete antithesis of everything they believe in.
Well, in the UK, I don't know if you have it here, but the Me Too movement, it fascinates me that they never seem to say anything about these, what I call clannish tribal cultures who have a completely different view of women.
Yeah.
And to your point, again, in our report, a woman, if she accuses in Pakistan a man of rape, she has to have 4 male witnesses who actually have to witness and swear that they've seen her being penetrated by the rapist. And you've actually got women in prison because if she can't prove that she's been raped under those rules, then she can be sent to prison. And there are many women languishing in Pakistani prisons for that very reason. And this is the sort of extraordinary cultural oil and water which just doesn't mix, Joe.
Well, it's also the mental gymnastics that you have to accept that as a part of Britain. And because you're progressive is really crazy. It just shows how these ideologies, these cult-like ideologies can completely defy logic, completely defy common sense, and just you have a set of rules that you're supposed to adhere to. If you deviate from those rules, you're a racist. You don't want to be a racist, right? Then everyone's welcome.
As you say, it's honor killings. It's tribal.
Yeah.
Your first loyalty is to your tribe and your family, not to your host country who's actually got their own laws.
Yeah. At the beginning of this, he talks about, Joe is talking very specifically about how these people they wind up, it's completely patriarchal and the women wind up as second-class citizens. And you're like, well, what about the trad wife movement? He doesn't see it. Again, it seems like he's only picking out very specific moments of the patriarchy that he can point out.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, he says, well, you're considered racist. He says you daren't speak out against honor killings or you're worried you'll be called racist. Nobody is supporting honor killings. He's saying, like, how are people supporting that? No one is supporting honor killings at all. Like, look, I'm against honor killings. Honor killings are bad. Honor killings are misogynistic. Honor killings should be banned, and anybody who's ever done one should be sent to prison for life. I can say these things, and I'm not scared that people just called me racist for saying those things, because it's stupid to think that that's even a thing.
Yeah, and it turns out murder is against the law, so we just arrest people who do that. So it's already against the law. We don't need a very specific law against these things that are happening. We already got one.
Yep, exactly. And I'd also like to point out he cares an awful lot about how women are treated by Islamic societies. Let's look at the statistics for, say, domestic violence in the UK and what the ethnicity breakdown of that is. Are we seeing that domestic violence is disproportionately likely to be perpetrated by people who are like Islamic or from Muslim backgrounds? I don't think so. I think there's plenty of white guys who are represented in those DV stats. He mentions the Me Too movement as well, how the Me Too movement never took a look at the people from these societies. The Me Too movement in large part was about men in power abusing their power throughout society. There are fewer men in power who are in power because of their Muslim identity.
Yeah, and he's talking about this as if there's no way that these people can change, right? I think that people who come and grow up in America or in the UK, they see that particular cultural norm as awful, and they change how they treat other people, right? Maybe they come here to escape that very specific cultural norm in their other country. So the problem here is a racist problem. Joe doesn't believe that people who look like that can change their ideas when they're exposed to other ideas. And he's a marketplace of ideas guy. He's a guy who quotes that all the time and talks about how great that is. Well, why don't we let people from other cultures come here and be exposed from our marketplace to a marketplace of ideas? Because Joe thinks they can never understand things because they're lesser people.
Yes, yeah, exactly that. And he talks about the mental gymnastics that the progressives are going through. The mental gymnastics aren't from progressive people. It's from Joe, because he's railing against the idea of what he thinks some people say you have to believe, when there is nobody saying you've got to believe that other than him. That's where the gymnastics are coming in here.
All right, so this next clip, this is about integration.
As I say, we've been very tolerant of people who've needed help. We've let them into the country. And on the whole, they have integrated and they have contributed.
Right.
And I have no problem with that. Like you, I'm absolutely in favor of that. And
the only problem is the people that aren't integrating.
If people don't want to come and live and integrate and contribute, then they shouldn't come. They should remain in their own country.
Well, it's also the idea of incentivizing people to illegally migrate to your country is just pure insanity. You're going to run out of money. And you're also putting a burden on these taxpayers for no reason whatsoever. It's a bad use of their tax dollars.
But in our immigration document, we put forward, the case for basically a hostile environment. We don't want to be handing out welfare.
Right.
We don't want to be encouraging people to come. We want to create a hostile environment and encourage people to go, unless they're contributing, to go back to their own country. And live there, particularly if they don't like our culture and our laws and they don't respect us and they think we're the infidel.
But do laws exist that would allow you to deport those people?
Well, you'd have to repeal. So that's why it's so important we win an overall majority in Parliament by 29, because then we can repeal a lot of this legislation, which will then empower the nation state again.
So this is the legislation that provides healthcare, dental, welfare, housing.
This is legislation largely passed by Tony Blair and his acolytes.
And this was all just to encourage mass migration.
I think it was to encourage this mass immigration and make it very difficult to stop it practically.
So at the start there, Rupert Lowe is saying, I've got no problem with people who come here and they integrate. Although, if you commit any crime while integrated, he will revoke your nationality and deport you to wherever your grandma was from, even if you and neither of your parents have ever been there.
Yeah, man. And listen to what he said earlier. He said, well, if you're not our religion, you shouldn't come here. So that's what he means by integrate, by the way. He means you need to change a lot of the things about yourself. And creating a hostile environment is exactly what Jeff Sessions said to dissuade immigration here in the United States during Trump's first term. That is a horrible thing. And it also gets people who come here to resent this country more. It's really just negative all around. There's no benefits to this to anyone.
Yeah, that's true. Although it actually was ours before it was yours, because the hostile environment policy was explicitly the name of the policy under David Cameron's government when Theresa May was Home Secretary, to make the environment as hostile as possible for illegal immigrants, to a point where they even had a van which just had written on the side, "Are you here illegally? Go home." And they had that driving around the country to sort of make it clear to people you weren't welcome here. So this was old school racism from the Tory government that he's harkening back to as the halcyon days. And then when he's saying we need to repeal the laws, Joe is then pushing back on, not pushing back, he's asking, which laws do you need to appeal? And as he asked that several times, Rupert Lowe just evades that question and isn't specific because he's got nothing. Because there aren't laws that do the things that he's talking about, that give migrants access to all this amazing kind of welfare and dentistry and healthcare and all these kind of specific things over and above the British people. Those aren't laws. He's just made those up or repeating right-wing talking points. So he has to evade when Joe even asks him in a conversation.
How long has it been since Tony Blair was in power?
19 years. 19 years, and yet it is still all Tony Blair's fault.
Who had it between Tony and this, huh?
Yeah.
Who was in power between then, huh?
We had 14 years of the Tories in between. We had a couple of years of Gordon Brown and a couple of years of Starmer. But yeah, when Tony Blair was in power, I was in my 20s. I wasn't grey at all. Yeah, that's how long it's been.
All right, last clip in our undercard. Joe is going to thank Rupert for coming on.
Well, listen, man, thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know it was difficult to get here for this day, and this is the only day we had open. So
no, it's very kind of you to have me on, Joe. And I know it's some big celebrations tomorrow. So
good luck to you.
Yeah, we're going to win. I'm amazed at the support we've got, and I'm amazed at the number of people who, even on the plane, come up to me and thank me for what I'm doing and say they're going to vote for us. I think Britain's on the turn, and hopefully, if we put up shop, tell them what we're going to do, give them a chance to vote for us. If they vote for us, I shall do my best to change things. If they don't vote for me, well, that's their prerogative. That's democracy.
That's democracy. Good luck, sir. Thank you.
Pleasure.
All right.
He says there's so many people on the plane who thank him for what he's doing. It's like, yeah, but I bet you flew business class. So we know who's thanking you there, Roops.
I like, too, that he's like, we're going to win. It's like, yeah, with Elon's bankroll, we're bound to win. There's a lot of money in that. Yeah.
Yeah. Or maybe the plane's the Lolita Express. Maybe they got it back out of commission, and that's who's on the plane. It's Elon Musk and his ilk. But yeah, and the way they're ending is that we're going to win. Well, you've got to win. Good luck, sir. Like, he ends that way because ultimately this was a party political broadcast on behalf of a fringe far-right political party that enjoys the patronage of a white supremacist, sometimes trillionaire with the loudest propaganda tool on the planet.
Yep.
And because that's the case, the rape of young white girls was just the vehicle by which Rupert Lowe could try and push his political agenda. He does not give a fuck about those victims. He's made that pretty clear here.
Yeah. Let's wrap it up with that. Thank you, sir. Appreciate you very much. You're a beautiful person.
All right. So, Marsh, here we are. End of the show. Was there anything good in this?
I think there actually was. It's fleeting, but it's there. Rupert Lowe points out that there's too much wealth in the UK held up in his generation, the people a bit older than him, the baby boom generation. He says it's all people worried about their retirement, their compounding wealth altogether, and that's contributing to a cost of living crisis for younger people. And I totally agree. I think that is a real issue. There's too much wealth that is being held by older generations, and that is not trickling down. It's not released into society, and it's causing real issues. I think that's a problem. Rupert Lowe then immediately talks about how raising taxes only means that wealthy people are going to leave. So his solution isn't very good. And also, he does point out, therefore, that that's going to happen. That seems to be a form of migration he's apparently completely understanding of and has no real issue with. Those people aren't evil immigrants for leaving for being economic migrants in that kind of way.
I do think that there is something good in this. There is a lot of pushback against hatred for gay people, hatred for women. I just wish Joe would do that when it was white people who was doing that sort of work instead of just brown people. But there is a lot of pushback for this. And I guess maybe if you caught around the racist portions, you could turn this into something good. But there's really not a lot of something good because all of this is motivated by racism.
Yeah.
All right. So that's it for the show this week. Remember that you can access more than a half hour of bonus content every single week for as little as $1 an episode by subscribing at patreon.com/NoRogan. Meanwhile, you can hear more from me at Cognitive Dissonance and Citation Needed, and you can hear more from Marsh at Skeptics with a K and the Skeptic podcast and sometimes Citation Needed. And we'll be back next week for a little more No Rogan experience. If you love the show, please rate and share it. If you want to get in touch with us, become a patron, or check out the show notes, go to norogan.com, KNOWROGAN.com.